And for more on the possibility of ground troops in Libya, earlier I spoke with Alan Kuperman. He is professor at the University of Texas at Austin and author of this book, The Limits of Humanitarian Intervention, Genocide in Rwanda. I asked him if sending in NATO ground forces would end the Libya conflict more quickly, or if this would be a huge mistake. Here's his take.
I don't think there's going to be a speedy end through military force. If there's going to be escalation on behalf of the rebels in Libya against Gaddafi's regime, that seems to me probably a long road. The rebels are really a ragtag force. In fact, ragtag might be overly complimentary. It would take months and months to really get them together to the point where they could take on a decent conventional military like Gaddafi's. So no, I don't believe that's a quick end. I think the way to a quick end would be a negotiated agreement. And for a negotiated agreement, you're going to need two things. First of all, you need to tell the rebels they're not going to get a complete victory. They're not taking over the country. They're only going to get a share of power. And then you have to be willing to deal with the Gaddafi regime, elements of it, and say that going forward, they don't all have to step down and leave power, that some of them are going to get to stay on with some political and military power. That's the way to a quick end. If we try and do this military way, it's going to not end quickly, and it's going to get a lot more people killed, as it already has done.
So we hear the coalition, though, not talking about brokering a peace agreement, but rather talking about it in military terms. So why do you think that they aren't looking at this option? What do you think they're really trying to achieve in Libya, if not a quick end?
Well, I think that President Obama sort of revealed his hand early on. Even though the UN resolution only authorized military action to protect civilians, President Obama said from the beginning that Gaddafi had to step down and leave the country. So it's clear what President Obama wants. He wants regime change. And a negotiated agreement is not necessarily going to get you regime change. And so that may be why we're seeing instead NATO and the United States in the lead pushing this sort of military escalation. I think it's a terrible idea, both because it's going to increase the humanitarian cost. There's going to be more civilians, non-combatants killed and wounded. And moreover, it's going to help bring to power, at least in part of the country, this rebel force which has elements of radical Islamists in it. So it's not good for the people of Libya, and it's not good for the U.S. national interest either.
Have you seen a situation, because you've been critical of the intervention all along for the reasons that you've stated, and you've compared it to rebels getting support internationally, using the same tactics, propaganda tactics you've called it, in Kosovo, in Bosnia, and other conflicts where the United States has gotten involved. So I'm curious if you've seen a resolution where there was not intervention and things worked out just fine, and there was a peace agreement brokered, and great humanitarian toll wasn't taken.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a case that I've written about, published an article in a book, and that will also be a chapter in a book that I'm working on this whole question. And that's the case of Liberia in 2003, where, as you remember, there was a fairly ruthless leader named Charles Taylor, and there was a civil war going on with rebels, and the United States came in, did not put any large-scale boots on the ground, did not launch a bombing campaign, did put some Marines off the coast, but the key was they engaged in diplomacy. And what they did is they said to the rebels, you can't conquer the country, you can only have a share of power.
So why aren't they doing that now?
They said to the leader, Charles Taylor, I'll just say that they said to Charles Taylor, you have to go, but you will get amnesty in a third country. And they said to the people under Taylor, you don't have to go. You can continue to have a share of power. So everybody had an interest in peace. And what happened is you got a peace agreement, and here we are 8 years later, and there's still peace in Liberia. So why didn't the Obama administration pursue a similar course in Libya? I think, is in part because he was getting bad advice, as I say, from people like Samantha Power and Susan Rice, who have made it their mission over the last decade to advocate for military force on humanitarian grounds. And sometimes that can work, but it should only be used in extremis, and it wasn't the case in Libya. And as I've warned, if you use it inappropriately, then it can actually cause more harm than good.
And just very briefly, Gaddafi escaped a NATO missile strike in Tripoli, but his youngest son and 3 grandchildren under the age of 12 did not. They were killed. Is this an example of the United States overreaching the UN resolution, and is this a violation of international law?
It's clearly not authorized by the UN resolution, which authorized all necessary means to protect civilians. And so protecting civilians would be stopping forces that are in the process of attacking civilians. Trying to assassinate a leader is not within the realm of protecting civilians. So, international lawyers can say whatever they want, but I think a normal person reading that resolution would say that it did not authorize assassination. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when you start attacking the leaders of countries for their behavior in a civil war against rebels, where they're clearly not targeting civilians en masse, you set a very dangerous precedent. And I've said this before, that how about if somebody around the world didn't like the way Barack Obama is prosecuting wars in Iran, Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Libya? And they said, well, then Barack Obama is a legitimate target. Let's assassinate Barack Obama. Would Barack Obama feel that was okay? And how about if they bombed the White House and killed his wife, Michelle, or one of his daughters, Malia or Sasha? Would he say, well, that's a legitimate target, I understand that? Of course he wouldn't. So if it's not good for the goose, it's not good for the gander. If it's not legitimate to attack the U.S. in that way, then it's not legitimate for us to attack Libya in that way. Now, when I say us, in this case, it was NATO. I don't believe it was a U.S. munition or a U.S. craft that launched the attack, but it was NATO. We're part of NATO, and it was ill-advised. I personally think when you do something ill-advised, you should acknowledge it and apologize for it. And instead, NATO is just plowing ahead and saying, well, that was a legitimate target, and we did nothing wrong. They did do something wrong, and we shouldn't do it again. And my preference would be that we actually acknowledge the mistake.